Have you ever really thought about stories? I mean, we tend to see them as just entertainment, right? A way to escape reality for a little while. But what if I told you that the stories we read, and maybe more importantly, the ones we tell ourselves, are actually changing the physical wiring of our brains, and that, in turn, is shaping the life we actually live? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into.
So, let's start with a classic stereotype. You know the one I'm talking about, the bookworm. The person who's always got their nose in a book, maybe a little socially awkward, more at home with fictional characters than real people. It's this picture of total isolation. But is there any real truth to it? Does getting lost in a good book actually disconnect you from the world? Well, the science tells a completely different story.
So, here's our game plan for this deep dive. First, we're going to bust that myth of the lonely reader wide open. Then, we'll look at that amazing feeling of being totally lost in a story and what's actually happening in our brains. And finally, we're going to see how we can use all this to rewrite the most important story there is, our own.
Okay, let's jump right into section 1, the social bookworm myth. We're about to challenge that old stereotype, not with opinions, but with some fascinating, hard data from psychological research.
This really breaks it down, doesn't it? On the left, you've got the stereotype we all know. Readers are loners, socially isolated. But on the right, that's what the science is actually showing us. Researchers at York University decided to really put this to the test, and what they found was kind of stunning. It turns the whole idea on its head. Far from being isolated, it turns out that fiction readers actually show higher empathy, they report having more social support, and even have better social skills.
So, when you dig into the study, the results are crystal clear. The more fiction someone read, the better their social abilities were. They were just better at understanding other people. But here's the real twist. The study also found this subtle but really interesting link between reading mostly nonfiction and, well, higher feelings of loneliness.
And this chart just says it all, doesn't it? Look at that bar for fiction readers. It's way up there. They feel more connected, more supported by the people around them. It's almost like diving into the complex social worlds and stories is a kind of practice, like a flight simulator for human relationships.
So this tells us that something much deeper is going on than just reading words on a page. And that brings us to our second section. We're going to explore the science behind that feeling of being completely and utterly lost in a book, a phenomenon scientists actually call narrative transportation. You know this feeling. Narrative transportation is when the world around you just melts away and you are in the story. Your heart pounds during a chase scene, you feel a character's heartbreak like it's your own. It's this wild psychological state where your brain kind of stops distinguishing between what's real and what's fictional. And this isn't just some poetic idea, it's a real, measurable thing.
And here's where it gets really amazing. We can actually see this happening inside the brain. Researchers put people into fMRI scanners, those big tube-like machines that map brain activity, and had them listen to stories. They were looking for the brain's unique fingerprint, that specific neural signature, for being completely transported by a narrative.
Okay, so this brings us to the really cool stuff. What is actually going on up there when you get hooked by a story? Let's dive into the neuroscience and see how our brains literally build a bridge between a fictional story and our own sense of who we are. And get this, the brain activity was so unique, so distinct, that scientists could look at the scans and predict with over 75% accuracy how immersed a person felt. That's incredible. It means that subjective feeling of being lost in a book has a real physical fingerprint in your brain. So, what's causing it? Well, it boils down to two key parts of the brain that start lighting up and talking to each other, creating what you could call a story network. First, you have the posterior medial cortex, or PMC. Think of this as the command center for your sense of self. It's where you keep your own life story, all your memories about you. Then, there's the inferior frontal gyrus, or IFG, which is all about understanding language and processing emotion.
And this right here is the magic link. The study found this powerful, consistent connection between these two areas whenever someone was really into a story. This isn't just random brain activity. This is the part of your brain that processes the story's emotion and meaning, talking directly to the part of your brain that holds your identity. A story isn't just data, it's getting mapped right onto your own life.
And that changes everything. Because if stories from the outside world can plug directly into our sense of self, then what about the stories we tell ourselves every single day? Could we actually use this same mechanism to change our own lives? It's a concept that psychologist Timothy Wilson calls story editing. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. A toolkit for consciously changing your personal narrative, the story you tell yourself about who you are.
The whole point is to create real, lasting changes, not just in how you think, but in what you actually do. It's about becoming the author of your own life.
To see just how powerful this is, let me tell you a story from another psychologist, Susan Weinschink. She talks about a time in her life where just everything went wrong. Bad breakup, new city, no money, sleeping on the floor. Then her apartment gets a horrible flea infestation. And as the universe's final punchline, she takes every piece of clothing she owns to the laundromat to deal with the fleas, and it all gets stolen. She had literally hit rock bottom, feeling totally alone and vulnerable. And in that moment of absolute crisis, she had this light bulb moment. She finally identified the unconscious story that she'd been telling herself her whole life. And on the surface, it sounds amazing, right? I am a strong person. I can handle any crisis. I mean, that sounds like a great story to have, a story of resilience.
But then came the shocking realization. Her empowering story had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. She was, without even knowing it, making choices that led her into crisis, that put her in these terrible spots, just so her subconscious could prove that story right, that she was strong enough to handle it. The story wasn't just describing her life, it was creating it.
So that led to the big question, right? If her old story was basically designing a life of constant struggle, could she consciously write a new one to create something different? Could she actually edit her own narrative?
And that's exactly what she did. She chose a new story. It's so simple, but so radically different. My life is easy and graceful. That's a complete identity shift. She's going from someone who thrives on crisis to someone who expects and allows ease.
The effect was almost immediate. A coworker popped her head in and asked how she was doing. Now, the strong person would have just said, "I'm fine." But the person whose life is easy and graceful, she did something totally new. She told the truth. She asked for help. And that one small act, driven by a new story, changed everything. Her coworker offered her a place to stay, which let her get out of her lease, find a better home, save money, and build a real friendship. A new story led to new actions, which created a whole new reality. So, when we put all this together, it's pretty clear. That old idea of stories as just a simple escape from the real world, it's just not the whole picture. We've seen how they can literally make us more social and how our brains wire them directly into our sense of self.
And that's the ultimate takeaway here. Stories aren't passive things we consume. They are an active, powerful tool. They're the blueprint our brain uses to make sense of the world, and more importantly, to build our own identity. We actually use them to construct our reality. Which leaves us all with one final, pretty important question to think about. What is the unconscious story you're telling yourself every single day? Is that story serving you? Is it building the life you actually want to live? And if it's not, maybe it's time for an edit.